Well, hey, everybody. So glad you could join us today. I'm always thrilled when I get a chance to introduce you all to one of the people that I've gotten to know through our work. Churches hire us to help them find a pastor. And many years ago now, a church called Ecclesia, and people, that don't know it call it ecclesia, all these different things. I'm like, no. We actually have an ecclesia here in Houston. We were attending there at the time. I know this. And Ecclesia in Hollywood contacted us and asked us to help find them a pastor. And so, like, where are we going to find somebody that fits in Hollywood? And one of my good friends who's worked here a long time, Jay Mitchell, said, how about this guy in Brussels? I'm like, what are you talking about? So that's how I met John Ritner. And I think you're going to enjoy meeting him and hearing about the very particular ministry challenges he's having. I think some of the things he's facing today in his context are a predictor of what everyone's going to be facing in the United States in the coming years. So I think what you're going to hear today might be a preview of some of the challenges you're going to face in the future. And I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about general cultural climate and how that works. So I'll stop talking. John, welcome to the podcast. Love having you here. And I would love for you to tell us just a little bit of your story and how you ended up in ministry and how you ended up where you are right now.
Yeah, thanks so much, William. It's great to see you again. I think the last time I saw you in person was one of the last times I traveled before COVID. We were out in Orlando in Florida at Exponential, and man, it's just great to be with you. And thanks for this opportunity. I grew up in and around church like many people, and ended up going off to college and deciding I was going to do my own thing. And I had been so churched and didn't have a great taste in my mouth about it that I kind of decided to leave church. And church was something in my past, not part of my future. And I ended up actually joining a fraternity house. And in that fraternity house, I met 7 guys who were basically living as missionaries in a fraternity house. They had embedded in this house and were living out the life of Jesus. They weren't inviting anyone to church. They were just being the church in a fraternity house. And that's the first exposure I really had to kind of a gospel-centered community. And over 18 months, Jesus used that to really kind of woo me to him. And that's when I first made a decision to follow Jesus and realized that there was something so compelling about living the life of Jesus in a hard and complicated environment or culture that was maybe even hostile to the truths of Jesus. And so I began to kind of get involved in ministry, and I led a fellowship of Christian athletes group for several years, and eventually decided to kind of go into full-time vocational pastoral work, and went to seminary, and then went back to my college town in Williamsburg, Virginia, and spent 10 years working in a church in kind of every role from, student pastor and discipleship director. And I think I ran the women's ministry for 6 months at one point while we, were in between staff. But you know how it is, a church that goes from about 500 to 4,000, you're getting shuffled around. You're doing a little bit of everything. And over those 10 years, some of that initial passion that I had to live the Jesus life out in the world and to see the world transformed, I began to realize it was kind of dying. I couldn't figure out what exactly was going on, but I almost felt like the passion was being kind of choked out of me. And when I think about that time now, I really think about the crisis I was having in 3 ways. Like initially I was kind of having this crisis of mission, that the mission or the calling of my life, the reason I got into ministry was because I wanted to see lives transformed by the power of Jesus. I wanted to see people come to Jesus and to see their world changed and to see Jesus's kingdom come in the world. But so much of my time was being spent just with existing Christians who had already been transformed by Jesus. And I didn't have any bandwidth to kind of be out with those who didn't know him yet. And so I remember one day thinking, I feel like I'm a program director on a Christian cruise ship. And my job is just to kind of create high quality programming for all these Christians to keep their lives busy. And I don't enjoy doing that. My energy, really, I wish I could be out in the world meeting those who don't know Jesus. And so I thought, how did I get here? And then I realized that even with all the programming we were creating, I didn't know if we were actually impacting people's lives. Like, were more activities, was that actually the goal? And was there any fruit from that? And, around that time, Bill Hybels and Willow Creek, they put out their Reveal study and basically showed that, more Christian activities does not actually lead to kind of a deeper spiritual formation. And so That was frustrating me. And then finally, I was having kind of a crisis of leadership where I realized that the appeal of the big platform, the megachurch, was kind of changing something in me, and I'd gotten into ministry for, basically for what I felt like were all the right reasons. And I was, making no money and working long hours and had 2, 3 jobs in order to be able to do what I loved. And now I was kind of longing for that spotlight and the big paycheck and the company car and, the dream of some rich person in the church paying for my house and my kids' college and going, oh, that's, those are the perks that come. And I just felt this corruption. And in the midst of all that, God did something amazing. He kind of allowed me to step out of that rat race, so to speak, and put a new call in my life when I bumped into a friend from Brussels. And you mentioned, that's where I was at the time. There was a European missionary who I had known, and he came and spoke to our staff and shared about the challenges of post-Christian Europe.
Wow. I'm reminded of the old Lily Tomlin quote where she said, the problem with the rat race is even if you win, you're still a rat.
Yeah.
So you moved to Brussels, which not the Bible Belt of the world. And tell me about the ministry there.
Yeah, that invitation was a little whisper from the Holy Spirit in that staff meeting where I felt like God said to me, what if you could go to the future of America, which is
wow,
in Europe culture? What if you could go there and experiment with how the church is going to need to adapt and then come back to America and prepare the church for the culture that's coming? And that's really what we got to do. I felt like I almost got to kind of, like a Back to the Future film, go into the future and see the European culture in many ways is 20, 30 years ahead of where America is, especially when it comes to spirituality and religion. I say Europe, when it comes to Christianity, they've been there, they've done that, they have the cathedrals to prove it, they're not interested. Christianity is part of their past, not their future. It's considered authoritative and repressive and antiquated. No one's interested in it. And so when by joining a team there that was trying to engage the culture and grow local churches, I realized pretty quickly that all of the skill set, all the paradigms that I had in America as a pastor, they didn't work over there. It is the old analogy of kind of like, having a hammer and going over and finding out that, the world is all screws. And you go, well, I can hit you as hard as I want with the hammer. It's not going to do anything. And so I had to kind of develop some new tools, new paradigms, new thoughts in order to engage there. And thankfully, I was surrounded by a team of people who had been doing it for many years. And, in this missions organization, Communitas International, had church planters all over Europe that were regularly collaborating and sharing what they were learning. And so in Europe, those paradigms shifted. And, I think the biggest shift of post-Christian culture that I often share with people is that the church itself has lost home field advantage. If you're a sports fan, they've lost the place at the center of society. American culture for years, the church was the largest building on this town square. It always had a central location. Sunday mornings were sacred. You didn't program against a Sunday morning because you knew people were going to go to church. Holidays, school holidays were built around religious, Christian events and stuff. And then you go to Europe and realize that Christianity is just one of many worldviews. It's one of many philosophies, and it doesn't hold that special prized central position anymore. And so if you're used to operating in the mainstream, if you're used to having all the advantages, all of the kind of the tide flowing with you, and now all of a sudden you realize that everything you do is going against the tide. Everything you do has to operate from the margins and not from the mainstream, so to speak. It really changes your approach. And the big thing, of course, is that it takes away the key element that America has relied on to make disciples for 50 plus years, if not 200 years, which is the Sunday morning. That the Sunday morning worship service is no longer seen as a culturally relevant or appropriate place for the secular world to join. It's not their culture, in the same way that for a Christian, you probably didn't wake up this week considering going to a synagogue or going to a mosque in order to pursue your spirituality. You thought, that's not my culture, those aren't my buildings, I'm not interested in going there. And so even if you were invited, you'd probably kindly but appropriately turn it down and just say, we're not interested in that. That's basically the entire European culture when it comes to any form of Sunday gathering. So the question then becomes, if you're an American church that has always put your, best money, your best resources, your best talent into Sunday morning, and now Sunday morning is removed from your disciple making structure, do you have anything left?
Mm.
Really the challenge that we had over there was, how do you recreate a disciple making structure that doesn't start with Sunday morning?
And so that is the natural segue to why my friend Jay Mitchell said to me, I know a guy, because we talked about Ecclesia Hollywood. Really, it's not even Ecclesia LA. And you know, explain to me the context that you walked into when you got to that church, and where God connected the dots between Brussels and Ecclesia.
Yeah, I mean, Ecclesia is a church that's about 15 years old. I didn't start it, like you said. I joined something that was probably in kind of Ecclesia 3.0 by the time I got here, but it's about 85% industry, entertainment industry professionals, creatives, artists, storytellers, many of whom moved here from different parts of the country to follow their dream. Some who are natives to this area, but they all share in common that desire to tell redemptive stories to the world and to be part of creating beauty in art. And that's kind of their passion and calling. And yet many of them grew up in Bible Belt, Midwest, and grew up with a faith, and then came out here and realized that experience, that Midwestern Southern faith, is not the shared experience on the West Coast in many ways, right? In more of a progressive, but also more of a secular culture. And so the challenge is that often what happens is, when someone who has been used to being protected, and kind of guarded, so to speak, in the majority, when they come out and become the minority, when they kind of almost immigrate to another place, the natural tendency is to cluster up. And this is why every major city in America has Koreatown, Chinatown, all the different kind of ethnic neighborhoods, because people immigrate, they get a little scared about entering the new culture, and they tend to find people like them and live in a kind of transplanted community that reminds them of home. And so when I got out here, what I realized was that a lot of the churches in LA, especially in Hollywood, are really just little Christian towns or Jesus towns like Chinatown. They are people who moved here and are a little bit overwhelmed by engaging the local culture and learning the new language and adopting the new. And they're a little bit afraid that if they do that, they're going to lose their distinctiveness. So they kind of cloister up and cluster up and decide, hey, if we huddle together, we won't get hurt, kind of thing.
Right.
What I love, though, was when I talked to Ecclesia in our interview process, their heart was, there was a recognition that they had been kind of doing that, but that because of some leadership issues and some kind of failures the church had, and part of it was just losing an incredible venue that they met in on Sunday morning, this incredibly epic historic theater that drew people in. Losing that, losing their leader, rethinking, I think they began to realize, we want to break out of this. We don't want to exist for ourselves. We want to actually break out and kind of engage in the culture more. There are issues of homelessness. There are issues of, lonely, starving artists who have no community. There's all sorts of things around us that we want to be a church for the city rather than inviting the city to come to church. And when I heard that kind of passion, I thought, oh my gosh, this is my language. And you may not even know it, but this is the only way you're going to make disciples in this new post-Christian culture. And so
Wow.
you actually, your impulse is in the right direction. And I don't have all the answers, but I've seen some things. What if we came and kind of experimented together and learned together in doing this? And so now we've been kind of in that process for about 5.5 years.
Wow. And if we were doing we're recording this in January, so on TV right now or wherever you're getting your content, there's the before and after pictures for the diet commercials because it's January, right? Tell me the before and after of you got here 5.5 years ago, however long it's been, and now, like, where's the journey led?
The before picture that comes to my mind is one of my first weeks on staff, when another staff member kind of heard my passion and maybe saw a little bit of my gifts and said, man, once we get you on stage, we're going to have 500 people again by Christmas. And I remember going, I love his enthusiasm. I can tell he's trying to compliment me, but his metric for success is still a big Sunday morning. And in his mind, the secret for success is a gifted professional who's going to draw them in. That's the before.
Hmm.
The after now is a community that gathers, currently as we're, because of Zoom, but Zoom has actually helped us with COVID, community that gathers every Sunday and has about 15 different people who participate in the service. And every week we have members of our community come on and share their stories of how they're following Jesus in their neighborhood, what they've done this week to try to bless other people. How is Jesus growing them during COVID? I, as the professional, have shortened my messages to allow more space for other people to tell stories. We've done communal prayers. We've incorporated the liturgy of communion every Sunday. We've done kind of even contemplative practices. But the service, so to speak, that we created on a Sunday is much more communal. It's decentered the professionals. And really, it's all about equipping everyday people to become disciple makers. And so the purpose of our Sunday service really is to share stories of what God did during the week out in the world. Whereas that before picture was all about the Sunday morning and how that's going to be the highlight of the week, And so,
I can't imagine being in a church where 85% of the people are in the entertainment industry and then trying to put on a show that impresses that group. It's almost like you have to run counter to all of that to even have any relevance, right?
yeah, absolutely. You have to kind of disrupt those expectations. And the irony that I learned that first year here, which again worked in my advantage as I was trying to decenter Sunday, was that all these people, they knew how to make the sausage, so to speak. That's the old phrase. I mean, they know how the sausage is made. So they're not interested in having it served to them on Sunday. They can tell why you edited that testimony video the way you did and why you lit it the way you did. And when you cut to B-roll, they know you're covering something that you didn't want them to hear. And so, when we tell stories, we never use videos. We always do it live. We always let mistakes happen because that creates, an authenticity and a transparency that is much more appealing than the kind of prefabricated showiness of Hollywood.
Well, I firmly believe, I hope we're not headed toward Europe super fast in terms of where we are, but I firmly believe that many, many places are, and was thrilled to see that you wrote a book. I think it's called Positively Irritating. We haven't talked about your book, so yeah, there you go. I was talking to a friend of mine, John Maxwell, years and years ago, and he said, about half the effort of writing a book is coming up with the title. And I'm fascinated by this title. So what's positively irritating? What in the world is that?
It's based on this metaphor that I opened the book with, which is that the same grain of sand that will get into the human eye, let's say on a beach, and create irritation and cause the human to kind of wipe your eye or to create tears, with the entire purpose of getting this irritation out of your eye so that it doesn't lead to infection and blindness. That same grain of sand, if it gets into an oyster in the ocean, will trigger a very different response. That irritant will actually trigger the oyster to not try to expel the sand, but to actually embrace it and come around it, and to begin to coat it with layer upon layer of beauty with this substance called nacre that eventually becomes a pearl. And so the irony is that it's not the irritant that determines whether you end up with blindness or beauty. It's the response to the irritant. And if you have a positive response to irritation, if you embrace it as something that can actually trigger beauty and innovation, then you can create something that's a gift to the world. And so I use that as a metaphor to say the church tends to have more of the human eye response to irritation, right? There's something that happens in culture that I don't like. We war against it. We fight it. We want to eliminate it, get rid of it. We want to go back to the way things were. And my point is, we're never going to go back to the way things were. And so our only choice when it comes to the irritation of post-Christianity, and also I would say the irritation of COVID, in this new pandemic potential world we live in, is to actually embrace the irritant. It doesn't mean that we, forego or lose our distinctives, but we come around it and we coat it with something innovative and adaptive and beautiful that we can ultimately offer to the world. And so the book is just about how Ecclesia has been trying to create beauty out of the potential irritation of a culture that no longer kind of centers the church and centers the life of Jesus. And so it starts 10 years ago with my crisis in Williamsburg and brings us over to Brussels and what we learned there and what post-Christian culture really is. And then it ends with some of the experimentation that we've been doing in Hollywood in ways that we failed, and then some of the ways that God has allowed us to succeed.
Well, what so I'm wondering, so the listener that's listening from Dallas or Birmingham, Alabama, or you're like, you don't understand, we still have Sunday school. You don't get it. I still use a hymnal. Like that's all fine for you all out in the land of fruit and nuts, but sorry, California, I do love you, but I'm just picking. Uh, you know, what are the transferable principles, and what if vision is being able to see a few feet in front of everyone else? What are some things you would tell people that are in a more that is still somewhat of a Christian culture that they can start to tweak now so that they're ready as these trends hit?
Yeah, I think that if you have leaders in those parts of the country who are honestly open to feedback and receiving it from the younger generation, what I would predict is that they have a sense that what we're doing isn't working the way it used to work. It's not as effective. That's what I often hear when I'm at conferences and am speaking with kind of on the idea of innovating within the church, is that people will say, we know what we're doing isn't working. We just don't know what else to do. You know,
Mm.
there was a generation that maybe went to youth group and then left to go to college, but then they got married, had kids, and came back to church, and now that generation's not coming back to church. And so there's a frustration of, why can't we get young people to come to church on a Sunday morning? And I think what I would say is, if you're experiencing any of that frustration, that young people aren't interested in what you're doing as much as they used to be, that's the sign, that's the indication, the litmus test, that this culture around you is beginning to change, and it's time for you to innovate, and not simply put on a better show Sunday that they can come to, but to really understand what it is that they're looking for, which is more of a authentic spirituality that engages the world rather than withdraws from the world. That actually kind of is the life of Jesus out in the culture around you, rather than simply the life of Jesus within the temple, on a Sunday morning. And so I think the best thing leaders can do, honestly, is to stay in touch with the next generation. I've always had a men's discipleship group of guys in their 20s, and I had it when I was 25, and I have it now at 45. That group doesn't get older. I keep them always in their young 20s because they keep me fresh. They keep me understanding what the culture is, and now I've got, a daughter who's 14. And so I'm learning from her as well, kind of how to stay connected to the spiritual interests and the spiritual patterns of that next generation, and recognizing that generation is much more of a mystical, independent, free thinking generation than the authoritative, institutional, structured generation that the boomers were, that created the church systems that we kind of have today. And so trying to find a way to, what I use the phrase, there's no such thing as attractional church or missional church or mega church. None of those are better than the other. The goal is to be a contextual church, to know your context. So if I was hired in Dallas, William, I would never come and just replicate what we've done here in Hollywood. But a good missionary moves into a culture, learns the language, adapts the practices, observes the traditions, and then expresses the good news in a way that's contextual to those people. And so we've trained our people to ask the question, what is good news to the people to whom I am sent? What would
That's gold. Say it again.
What is good news to the people to whom I am sent?
That is perfect. I believe that post COVID, you will see more spiritual receptivity than before. It's the first we've gotten knocked to our knees for a lot of people growing up, millennial in particular. Hadn't been a big war. There was 9/11, but frankly, a lot of people that are millennials don't even have much of a memory of that. We've been in a bull market for a long, long, long time. And this is the first they've had to stare death in the face and uncertainty. And I think there'll be receptivity. But I also think now that everyone's worshiping online, I've told this story a lot, but one of my good friends here in Houston, who's a pastor, is like, no one's ever going to come back to my church because they can now YouTube the best preaching on the planet. And I'm like, dude, you have a call to your context that nobody else has. And I think the people God will use the strongest in the next 10 years are the people who will relentlessly exegete their context and say, how do I translate the good news into this zip code? And I don't know if that's what you're saying, but
Yeah,
man,
let me just close with a story from our community that serves as a parable of what you're saying. There was a gentleman named Jason who was homeless for years and very heavy and overweight and struggling with depression. And eventually went from living in his car, he got a job as a security guard. He ended up being a security guard in our old theater when we gathered on Sunday mornings. Now, this was before I got here, but the church began to kind of reach out to him and invest in him, and he decided to kind of recommit his life to Jesus. He got healthy, and one of the things that he did to get healthy was he started eating grapefruits. And he had read that grapefruits up your metabolism. There's that whole grapefruit nutrition cult.
sure, sure.
So he was eating grapefruits all the time, and sure enough, man, he lost all this weight and got in shape. And then he had this incredible heart to reach his friends who were back still on the street. And so he would go to the store and he'd buy a whole bag of grapefruits, and he'd go back down to Hollywood Boulevard looking for homeless to hand out grapefruits to them. And he called it the grapefruit gospel. And he said his strategy was to go out and to give them something that was good news to him as a way to start conversations. And I remember when I met him, we were talking, I said, Jace, I'm thinking, I hate grapefruits. I don't know a lot of people who like grapefruit. In my mind, I just said, Jason, how does that go? Yeah, you don't either. He goes,
No, I do. I love grapefruit.
oh,
Sorry.
you the target audience for this ministry. He goes, no, you're right. They'll take them, but they don't seem very excited about it. So we were doing kind of a missional training within our community, and I said, Jason, what if you asked the question? I said, grapefruit is good news to you, but what if you asked, what would be good news to them? And he began to think about it, and he said, and so this was his idea. The next week, he went out in the street to where all these homeless guys were living, and he said to one of them, tell me about the food that reminds you of home growing up.
Wow.
What is the meal that's home, that defined your home? And this young Latino homeless guy said, oh, my abuela, she used to make these incredible wet enchiladas, and it was filled with this and covered with that. And he said, if I made those next Sunday, could we share them as a meal? And he went, of course. And he said, tell me more about it. So Jason went home, he Googled up a recipe, he bought all the ingredients, he did his best to cook it. And on Sunday afternoon, he showed up with 3 trays of wet burritos and said, hey, try them. Tell me if they're anything like your abuela's. And they invited the community, and they sat on the sidewalk and had this.
Wow.
This guy, of course, said, no, they're not like my abuelas. She did this, she did that. They laughed, but the love. And then Jason said, okay, hey, Richie, you're next. What food reminds you of home? And Jason did this faithfully every Sunday for several months.
Wow.
Brought a food, and he, again, he had such a better receptivity than the grapefruits. And eventually he took it to the next step where he said, why don't you come to my house and help me cook it? Because you know what it's supposed to look like. And so every Sunday he'd go pick up the person, they'd go make the meal, and then together they would serve it. And
Wow.
I just, that's such a great picture of the gospel, right? It's not trying to push some version of Jesus, a finger pointing, tongue clicking, Jesus that people aren't interested in. It's trying to figure out what characteristic of Jesus is going to be received and feel like good news to this person. And then how do I invite them to join me in actually telling that story out in the world?
That's amazing. What is good news to the people around you? Did I say it right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
That is gold, worth the whole podcast. And if you're paying attention, you're saying, what was it? Is positively irritating. And if you go to our show notes, then you'll see links to Ecclesia Hollywood, links to the book, links to John, Amazon, the whole thing. If you don't get our show notes, just go to vandercast.com and sign up. We won't beat you up with a bunch of emails for other things. It's just a way of sharing with you what we've talked about and where we're headed in the coming weeks. John, I am so glad that you have been on this journey and that we've gotten to see it for a while now. And I can't wait to see where God continues to move you. Thank you for your continued passion in the same direction. That's a rare gift.
Thanks for
And
this.
thanks for making time for us today. I really appreciate it.